All right, hello. Here we go. Well, yesterday in true transparency, I did not film. And I tried to do it in my kids' room after they fell asleep and it was too dark. And I was like, we're just going to have to talk about it tomorrow. So I read yesterday and I did read different chapters today, but I still want to talk about what I read yesterday. One of the things, well, the main thing that stuck out to me yesterday when reading Genesis was chapter 22, which is the binding of Isaac. And so I'm just going to read until I feel like I can stop reading. All right, so it says, now it was after these things that God tested Abraham. So God sends us tests. It's here in Genesis. So it's in the beginning, is going to be happening to us still, right? He said to him, Abraham. Hineni, he said. So God called Abraham, and Abraham said, Hineni. Now you remember that I'm reading from this Tree of Life Bible, and it leaves certain Hebrew words in there. And Hineni is a word which I never realized that Abraham was the first to say it in the Bible. I know that word from when I was reading, I believe, for Samuel, when it's talking about how, Hannah really wanted a child. Maybe that's in Genesis, but Hannah really wanted a child, and she went and she was weeping in the temple, and Eli thought she was drunk or, whatever they did back then, high or whatever, and thought, this woman is just hiding here. And she was like, no, I'm weeping and crying out before the Lord. And she was crying because she was barren and she really wanted a child. And she said, if you give me a son, I will give him back to you. So then she gets pregnant, she weans him, and she goes ahead and gives him to the prophet. I believe it's Eli. I might have my prophets wrong, but I believe it's Eli. And when Samuel's really young, he hears his name being called at night, and he's like, Hineni, here I am, and running to Eli. He did that like 2 or 3 times before Eli then figured out, like, oh, Samuel, this must be the Lord. So when he responds, when he calls you again, say, Hineni, here I am, Lord. So Hineni is not just a word about location, like I just instantly thought about grade school when they called your name and you say, Allison, I'm here, or if you're really fancy, present. That's not what this is. There's a readiness, a willingness to obey, an excitement to obey. And so you're just saying, I'm fully available. I'm fully present. I'm fully available. So that's how Abraham responds to God's calling. Hineni, he said. Then he said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. So he has to get real specific, right? Because technically we know at this point that that's not his only son, right? He has Ishmael. So from Hagar, the slave girl, the slave servant that was to his wife Sarah, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. That's intense. On one of the mountains about which I will tell you. So Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac, his son. So there's a lot of things going on right there. Take your son, your only son. At first it's like, okay, well, that's a little harsh, God, because he has 2 kids, but God had given Abraham, or at that time, Abram, a promise to say that this is what I'm going to do. His wife has been barren. You're going to have, well, he gave him the promise that you're going to have a multitude of nations, more seeds than there are sand. So he's like, well, I'm going to have a son first in order to get this ball rolling. And that's not happening. So God did promise that he would have a son. In the impatience of him and of Sarah suggested, hey, well, why don't you take my slave servant, which seems really harsh, but this is how things worked back then. And he took her as a wife and conceived. She had Ishmael. And then God was like, yeah, cool, awesome. That's not what I said. Or that's not what I meant, because yeah, I see you heard me, but you didn't understand me, which happens all throughout the Bible and still happening now, right? We hear you, I don't exactly know what you meant. So that's why we got to test things, right? And so he waits until Abraham's 99. Just crazy, right? So he got, I don't know if it was like almost like 14 years that he got this word that that God was going to give him a son. And then he didn't do it until he was 99, so he had him at like 100. And then, I don't know, Sarah's like 90 and able to breastfeed. It's amazing, right? But this is the promise that God gave him, so God can do anything. So if he says a thing, he'll do a thing, right? But take your only son. This to me is such a picture of God the Father and Jesus Christ the Son, right? This is, I just think, a beautiful picture. So, and I also love that when Abraham got this word, the next day, early in the morning, he went to go carry this thing out. Now, I know, or I can imagine, because I don't know a whole lot, but I can imagine how much torment Abraham was going through about that. Like, okay, what in the world? But you know what? He didn't let that slow down his obedience. And that's been something that I've been really working hard on, is having a faster obedience to what God is saying to me. So he got up early the next morning to go fill this out. He split the wood for the burnt offering. This is in chapter 22, verse 3. He split the wood for the burnt offering, got up and went to the place about which God had told him. Keep looking in the wrong place because I switched my camera. On the third day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Abraham saw his young men, and he said, "Sit yourselves down here with the donkey. As for me and the young man, we'll go up there and worship and return to you." So Abraham was confident that we're going to come back. Then Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on Isaac his son. In his hand he took the fire and the knife. So the two of them walked on together. Isn't that a beautiful image? And we've been seeing a lot of walking imagery throughout these first 22 chapters. Then Isaac said to Abraham, his father, "My father." Then he said, "Here I am, son." Now, what I don't know, because I didn't do an in-depth research about this, is that "here I am, son" also Hineni, or is that a different word? I'm assuming it's a different word, because otherwise they would have used it again here. But I think there's like now a reversal kind of thing where we're seeing father and son dynamics here. We're seeing God the Father and Abraham, a son of God. And then we're seeing Father Abraham and Isaac the son. So there's just some really interesting language. And he said, "Look, here's the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" Isaac, in his beautiful child ignorance, was like, "Okay, Dad, I know that we're gonna go do this burnt offering, but where's the lamb?" And Abraham said, "God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering, my son." And again, this is a great picture of Abraham and God, and also Jesus Christ, because God provided Jesus to be the lamb, right? And the two of them walked on together. That was the conclusion of verse 8. And I just think, man, how God must have been feeling. That was always the plan to send Jesus, right? And we see then, I believe they're called like types and shadows of Christ. We see the Christology, the study of Christ throughout the scripture. We see these foreshadowings of Jesus to come, and here's just another one. So then verse 9 says, "And then they came to the place about which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there, laid out the wood, bound up Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar and on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took his knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of Adonai called to him from heaven and said, 'Abraham, Abraham.'" See, we see twice. Now, in Hebrew culture, when you say twice, there's quite the emphasis. And we also see this again in like Martha, Martha, when Mary and Martha was getting super upset because Mary wasn't doing anything in the New Testament, we see that her name was repeated twice. Jesus did that. So there's an emphasis in there. There's also an urgency. I mean, he's also got a knife like he's going to slaughter his son. So I guess the sense of urgency is good. And then Abraham responded to his name being called from an angel in heaven. Abraham, Abraham. He said, Hineni. Then he said, meaning the angel, do not reach out your hand against the young man. Do nothing to him at all. For now I know that you are one who fears God. You did not withhold your son, your only son, from me. I think about how when we think of Father Abraham, and I think maybe Paul talks about this, or maybe it's John, about how when we die, we are at the bosom of Father Abraham. I think there's something beautiful here because Father Abraham's this first person that we wait until Jesus comes back, right? Until Jesus comes back, we are with Father Abraham. And I think it's such a beautiful picture that he's the one who receives us first, because he knows he was willing to give up his son, because guess what? He wouldn't have had a son had God not given him one anyway. So it's like, even when probably internally he's at having this wrestling, and this is what I assume, what I suspect, because he's human, that even though he had the faith to believe, there was still some internal things going on, like, oh my goodness, I'm going to do this, like, this is my son Isaac. I've waited 100 years to have this son, 100 years to see this promise manifest. He still knew who the promise giver was, who provided the promise. Remember, he said God will provide for himself a lamb. God promised, God delivered. So if God asks for it back, I know that God's going to do whatever he wants with it. It will be for his glory, and he can bring him back to life. He can do whatever. This is just the faith that he had. And I think sometimes we overcomplicate things, or maybe I should say I overcomplicate things in thinking, wanting to know so much more detail. Listen, he said, I want you to take your son and I want you to take him and sacrifice him. He got up early the next morning. We don't see anywhere where Abraham asked for the logistics, right? And I think this is a beautiful picture. This is also why he's the father of faith. Like, there was no template to follow for Abraham. He just trusted so much. He walked with the Lord so closely that we see he's able to make these decisions, able to follow and obey in such a beautiful way that he is constantly rewarded. And he's one of the first faces that we'll see when we get to heaven, in terms of, while we're waiting, you know, that's a whole nother thing about Revelation, and I don't know all that much about it. But I do know that when we get to this chasm, when it's split up, we are waiting and we're being held in Father Abraham's bosom, and he can receive us this way because he was willing to give it all up. And he followed when there was no other template to follow. There was not another man of great faith for Abraham to pattern himself after. And I think it's so beautiful. So for all of us, we should probably ask the questions, because God has wired us all uniquely. And there's probably some situations where you need maybe less detail. Maybe less is more sometimes, and we just follow. Now, if it's a hard saying and we're not sure, we maybe seek clarification. We think of Gideon and his fleece prayers, right? And we also know that once we know that this is what we've heard, then we go forth. We go forth and we walk, and we try to be fully present when God's talking to us. And so it's one of my favorite words that I've learned while doing my Bible studies is Hineni. I try to wake up in the morning, and, you know, after I say good morning, I say Hineni, because I'm trying to be as fully present and fully available as possible. All right. Have a great day. Bye.